Donald Trump is obsessed with these Central American criminal gangs. I mean, he was talking Friday in this Long Island appearance about MS-13, which is, I guess, a Salvadoran-based international gang, and describing in these horrible, violent, sounding very hyperbolic terms how awful they are, and they kill young girls and torture them for sport before they kill them. I mean, these people are the victims of whatever the reality of that is. They're legitimate asylum seekers who are fleeing those same gangs in Central America. Does the Trump administration, does Trump draw any distinction between asylum seekers and other undocumented immigrants?
Well, I think there's probably no one in this country who would argue that we shouldn't be vigorously hunting down and prosecuting and bringing to justice the Mara Salvatrucha, which is the sort of overall name of this particular Salvadoran gang. I think we should remember that this gang originated in the 1980s in Los Angeles. So this is a gang that started in Los Angeles, and its members were massively deported in that period of time. They went back to El Salvador, and because of the weakness of the institutions in El Salvador, they have, particularly in recent years, expanded very dramatically. So there are places in El Salvador where MS-13 or MS-18 or these gangs related to the Mara Salvatrucha are actually contesting government control. At the same time that there are gangs in places like Long Island associated with this organization that have been there for generations. It's not a new phenomenon. What's happening now is that you have, particularly the young people who've come in recent years, a lot of them have not had support. They've come without their family members in many cases, so they're kind of out there, and they're vulnerable to recruitment. So that is something that has been happening. But on the other hand, the victims of this gang, in many cases, are other immigrants, and even other immigrants from Central America, which is a distinction that President Trump did not make on Friday.
Yeah, I don't think he made any mention of that in his speech or in other speeches. I mean, I think he leaves the clear implication that illegal, undocumented immigrants are victimizing native-born Americans. He doesn't say that, but he certainly doesn't point out that these are immigrant communities and the most of victims are in the same immigrant community.
Yes, that's exactly right. And this is a real dilemma for the police who are trying to combat these gangs, because you really, it's very difficult to do that unless you can get some kind of cooperation from the people in the community. So many times you'll find now a conflict between the local police and even some people within Immigration and Customs Enforcement who are trying to work with informants and do classic police work to try and confront these gangs. And the Trump administration and its policies, which are not making the distinction between the community and the predator, and therefore making it much more likely that the community will not trust the police when they try and gain information about what the gang is doing.
The Trump administration's other fixation, and Jeff Sessions' fixation, is around these sanctuary cities. What effect does any of that actually have, that some large cities have declared themselves in that way protected spaces for undocumented immigrants or anti-deportation?
I think the first thing is that the word sanctuary has become sort of a common phrase, but it's actually, in most cases, a major misnomer. What many cities around the country have tried to do is to limit the cooperation with immigration authorities so that the immigration authorities and the police are working together to arrest and deport people who've committed crimes. So the whole notion of the sanctuary city was, in a certain way, an effort to focus everyone's effort on identifying the people that really are serious threats and committing crimes, and to not associate the police with immigration enforcement when the police have to confront the community in general. And so in most places that have now been identified as sanctuary cities by the Trump administration, the actual limitations on ICE are not great. It has to do with whether or not the cities will hold a person they have in their custody for extra time so that ICE can come and pick that person up. And a lot of cities have said, well, we're not going to do that. This is not just, kind of liberal strongholds by any means. There are police departments in, Dallas, Houston. They want to be careful about when they associate with immigration authorities because they need to have a relationship with the local community.
Julia, immigration enforcement is a central issue for Jeff Sessions. He's been in the front on the issue of challenging sanctuary cities and bringing, I think, more immigration judges to the border. What's his role in this?
Well, a peculiarity of our immigration courts is that they are not part of the judiciary. They're actually part of the Justice Department. So Attorney General Sessions is in charge of the immigration courts. And I think he's aware of the severe crisis that those courts are in. And he, interestingly, has been moving to approve and place many judges who were actually appointed by Attorney General Lynch. At the same time as in the Justice Department per se, he has really encouraged federal prosecutors to be undertaking immigration prosecution. So has identified a prosecutor in every district across the whole country to start bringing immigration cases. That would be people who returned after they were deported. There are a number of federal crimes that are associated with immigration. So and particularly in the case of the gangs, the Justice Department obviously has a very important role to play in the event that the Trump administration decides to prosecute these folks in the U.S. in the federal system rather than just deport them. So that's a little unclear as to whether they're going to do that or not.
How has policy on deportations actually changed since Trump became president? I mean, it's been more than in half a year now, and you hear all kinds of things. I mean, you hear that they've stepped up deportations, but maybe not that much. They're different. You get different hints about what's actually going on. What is their policy and what's different?
The big difference is that the Trump administration is ready to deport anyone who doesn't have legal status in the United States. The Obama administration, especially in the last 2 years, made increasingly focused efforts to target criminal immigrants who had been convicted of crimes. And there was plenty of work to do on that front. And the Trump administration has just wiped away all of the documentation, all of the instructions and guidance that steered immigration agents towards criminals who had convicted of crimes. And now the Trump administration has said, if an immigration officer thinks you might have committed a crime or you might be a risk to public safety, that person can be deported. But in addition, if anyone who is detained in the course of an ICE operation, what they call a collateral, those people are now being deported as well. And so there's no criteria anymore to prevent immigration and customs enforcement from deporting. For example, this recent case that we had, a guy in Ohio who was the father of 4 United States citizen children, no criminal record. He was just out of status and he had not been successful in the court and the man was deported.
That guy never would have been deported under the Obama administration.
Very unlikely. The other thing that's happening is that there are lots of people in the country who have been under what's called an order of supervision. So these are people who walked right up to the door of deportation, and then the authorities said, okay, this is not a bad guy. This is just an immigration problem. And so we'll allow this person to come in every 6 months, report to ICE. And as long as they don't commit any offense and, preserve the safety of the community, we'll let them stay. And all of those people now, when they're coming in to report to ICE, now they're being detained and deported.
Right. So in a way, the Obama administration policy was, we obviously have limited resources. We can't do everything. Let's focus on the worst criminals and be aggressive about deporting them. The Trump policy, in a funny way, is don't just focus on the worst criminals because we're not willing to acknowledge that we can't deport everybody. even though at the moment we're not really trying to deport everybody. We're just leaving a lot of ambiguity about who we'll deport and who we won't.
Yeah, so this has had a major impact in terms of spreading fear and concern and distress in immigrant communities. But in practical terms, in real terms, the numbers of people who've been arrested for deportation have gone up considerably. But the big increases in people precisely who don't have criminal records.
Yeah, you've reported on both sides of the border, Julia. I mean, what's the mood like among communities that flow back and forth? That is, migrants who move back and forth across the border to Mexico and other Central American countries. Is there greater fear about coming? Are people avoiding the authorities? I mean, what's life like for an undocumented immigrant now?
Well, part of the problem with this whole picture is that the scenario that you just painted of people moving back and across the border, that doesn't happen anymore. And that's big part of the problem. People can't leave because they can't get back in. And so and this is a problem that's existed for many years. The more you enforce the border, the more you bottle up the people who are out of status inside the United States because they can't leave.
Even though so much of it is historically seasonal labor, agricultural labor that would go back and forth multiple times a year.
Yes, right? Yes. But I think there is a general sense in Mexico that it's just much harder, much more dangerous, much more expensive to cross the border than it used to be. So that, and now with President Trump, that just caps it off for a lot of people. It's just not worth the risk for a lot of people in Mexico. The Central Americans are in a different situation because this is a very dangerous, these gangs are really brutal. They are trapped and their home community is suddenly taken over by a gang. If they go across the street into the territory of another gang, they can be murdered. It's a very dangerous situation. And so that's part of the problem. And an interesting thing to think about is the origin of this whole problem was this mass deportation of these gang members to El Salvador in the 1980s when the country was the institutions were so weak that the justice system in El Salvador could not absorb them. And now we're talking about doing the same thing again. So one has to wonder if that's good policy.